Croeso I pawb, welcome. Diolch yn fawr I dod. Croeso I Heolion Wyth Cymdeithas, welcome to Pillars of Society, and the third in our series of talks. We're very, very happy to have artists Angela Maddock and Sarah Toombs with us this evening to talk about memorialisation and commemoration, amongst other things. Fy enw I ydy Emily Loro. My name is Emily Loro and I am Community Art Coordinator at Oriel Martin Gallery in Carmarthen. This project is funded by the 15-Minute Heritage Grant Programme, a collaboration between the National Lottery Heritage Fund and CADW, the Welsh Government's Historic Environment Service. So a big thank you to them for making this project happen. Just a little bit of housekeeping. Can you please stay muted? I can hear that there's a few people who aren't muted out there, and it's just causes a bit of audio interference. So if you could stay muted, thank you. There will be a chance to speak later in the breakout rooms. You can turn your camera off if you want to, get comfy, come and go, make dinner, whatever you need to do is all fine. We will be recording and transcribing the event tonight and releasing it through our YouTube channel. So if you know anybody who wanted to come but had a clash, they will be able to see it again. We will be having a break after the first speaker, which will be roughly halfway through, and we will finish at 9 p.m. So for those of you who don't know, Oriel Martin Gallery is the main publicly funded art and craft gallery for South West Wales. We are currently closed because of COVID-19 restrictions, but there are still lots of things happening. We are having a new website as well, so social media is really the place to find out what's happening at Oriel Martin Gallery at the moment. We've just installed a beautiful exhibition by Helen Booth, and we will be sharing that exhibition in new and innovative ways, because obviously at the moment you can't come into the gallery. We also have a really beautiful podcast series with Ensemble Cymru, which is really amazing, aimed at children, but actually really lovely for adults too. So the project, Heolion Wyth Cymdeithas, Pillars of Society, will investigate the statues and monuments in Carmarthen, specifically the Picton Monument on Picton Terrace, the statue of William Knott, and their accompanying colonial history, the Crimean War Memorial, a war more famous for its nursing than its fighting, and we'll hear more about that later from Angela Maddock. And then two iconic symbols of Welsh identity, the Gorsedd stones and Gwynfor Evans's plaque. I have some notes here, by the way, that's why I keep looking down. The project is a response to the national and international debate around public art and colonial history. And we hope it will provide an opportunity to discuss race, equality, diversity, and Wales's experience as coloniser and colonised. We are working closely with students from Carmarthen School of Art who are participating in a series of workshops with artists and creating ideas for alternative works of public art, which will be displayed via an augmented reality app. There will also be new interpretation of the current statues and monuments via QR codes and a walking tour with an accompanying map. There's lots of opportunities to get involved. We have feedback forms online. Heolion Wyth Cymdeithas, Pillars of Society has its own dedicated Facebook page, so you can follow the progress of the project there. We have opportunities for volunteering, so please get in touch. If you would like to do that, I'll put my email in the chat, and the chat function is there to use as well all the way through this event. So I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Sarah Toombs, graduated from the Royal College of Art in 1987 and has been living in Carmarthenshire since 2004. She works with traditional sculptural materials of steel, bronze and stone, which is really why we wanted to get the perspective of a sculptor as part of this project. Sarah also works with less traditional materials as well. Sarah has pieces of public art in many parts of the UK, and you can see her work more locally at Abertawe Bro Morgannwg Health Trust and the National Botanic Garden of Wales. Sarah has taught at a number of institutions and is currently Honorary Research Fellow at Swansea College of Art. So we're very honoured and very happy to have Sarah talk to us tonight. So I'm going to hand over to you, Sarah. Diolch yn fawr.
Thank you very much for a lovely introduction, and thank you to everybody for joining us this evening. I'm just going to try and share my screen and start the talk. Right, has that worked? Yeah, okay, lovely. Thank you. Yeah, so the title of my talk is Looking Up, Looking Down, from Picton Monument to Gorsedd Stones. Not quite sure if I'll get as far as the Gorsedd Stones, but I'll try. So in this talk, I'm going to try to address some of the intricacies around remembering and public spaces, especially in the light of recent events concerning statues. How can memorials reflect people's history? And can they be truly inclusive? We'll look at monuments that do address contentious history, but that also celebrate people, including traditional sculptural monuments and also some temporary events. The word monument is derived from the Latin monere, which means to remind, but also to admonish, to warn, and to teach. The toppling of the Edward Colston statue into Bristol Harbour last year created really strong and polarised views, with some people claiming that it was the best art event of the year and should be awarded the Turner Prize. Others, however, described this action as the result of mob rule. And in the wake of many statues being taken down across the UK, I think 69 so far, the government quickly implemented a new law that requires planning permission before removing any historic monuments to protect them being removed on a whim at the behest of a baying mob. However, in reality, these events weren't the result of a whim. They were the culmination of long overdue debates that have been rumbling along for years. The Colston and Cecil Rhodes are just two statues whose removal had been petitioned for over 5 years, and also the request to change plaques to tell the full story. Robert Jenrick stated that we cannot and should not now try to edit or censor our past. Except, isn't that exactly what these statues have done? And in response to Jenrick, Ben Luke of the Art newspaper said, statues are not history. Often they are impediments to truth because they are erected to glorify the powerful as a fig leaf for their flaws and iniquities. And going right back to the Roman Empire, statues were made, in fact, to represent power, to serve the ruling classes and to celebrate war heroes. The many generals on horses that we see around cities are really good examples of this. And as we see here on the left, the Picton obelisk is totally imperialistic in its form. It encourages us to look up to the sky in awe. It creates a symbol of eternity, and it significantly hides the full story, just as Colston did. William Knott's history is different, but we still look up at him. He's on a plinth, his space is special, and it's apart from ours, which is on the ground. I'm going to read a quote from somebody called James E. Young, who's the Professor Emeritus of Judaic Studies at Amherst College in the USA. He says, quote, "Traditional monuments fix meaning, they are final. They serve a particular representative function, often ideological in nature. They present a singular point of view that prevents any other interpretation or use. Monuments are imbibed with expectations of specificity, permanence, and local identity within a national context. They are usually relegated to history or the pantheon of historical events and represent a grand narrative. These traditional monuments are represented as sacred and untouchable and are often out of reach on a high, often imposing pedestal. And this kind of monument really bears no relation to us now. And they're ones that we often don't really notice. We might walk past them without realizing what the story is about them, or even noticing their message. So how can we create memorials that may critique the past, but help us as nations recognize and learn from past mistakes? Recently, Mona Siddiqui said on Thought for the Day on Radio 4 that memorials should become a symbol of what a country can be, where it recognizes where it went wrong, and when it's got the courage to change its course. And that's what we are considering now. So we need to commemorate to actually help us. And in the, why won't this go? Sorry, just going to move on. So in the presidential inauguration, Biden recently attempted to do this. And what they did, instead of having people in the mall, because they couldn't, they lit 400 candles around the reflecting pool in the mall. And he said, in order to heal, we need to remember. Sometimes it's hard to remember, but that's how we heal. So he used his ceremony to reflect, to perhaps criticize the nation over all the deaths from COVID, because each candle, each one of the 400 candles represented 100,000 deaths from COVID in the USA. And so I found that really very moving. He didn't try and glorify himself, but he tried to encourage us to reflect on what had been happening recently. So I'm going to continue with America, and actually specifically the Mall, for a bit longer. So we're up here now, we're looking down on the Washington Mall. And if you look, you can see a sort of an upside down V that's cut into the earth there. And this, in fact, is the Vietnam Veterans Wall Memorial, commonly known as the Wall. And this was built in 1982. It was really poignant at that time because the Vietnam War had only really finished in 1975. So it's still an incredibly raw memory for many Americans. And so what Congress did was they held an anonymous competition. And in fact, the person that won the competition was a 21-year-old architecture student called Maya Lin. And she always maintains that actually she wouldn't have won this competition if they'd known who she was, because she is of Asian Chinese descent. And she chose to create something which didn't glorify the war. She chose to dig a V-shaped scar into the earth. And she said that this scar would never heal. She chose to make the wall out of black granite, which represents our mortality. And in that wall are 58,000 names of people that died or reported missing from the Vietnam War. And what's interesting about this is they're not in any order of their regiment, or they're not in orders of battles. They're in the order of the chronology in which they reported either dead or not missing. So when you enter into this space, if you're looking for a name, you have to really, depending on where the name is, take on board the whole magnitude of that 58,000 names that are inscribed into that wall. The other thing that's really telling about this is that she used black granite so that it reflected us, to remind us of our own mortality. So you see yourself reflected in those names. And she said that it was really important that she didn't want to make a memorial to the Vietnam War. She wanted to make a memorial to the veterans. And she said, this is not meant to be heroic. It's not inspiring. However, when this was installed in 1982, I think, it was Ronald Reagan was the president. They quickly realized that it was going to upset a lot of people, and it did upset a lot of people, particularly some of the congressmen. And so they campaigned to fundraise for a different kind of monument. They wanted a more living monument, something that actually represented some of the soldiers. And so the Three Soldiers was commissioned by a figurative sculptor called Frederick Hart to give humanity perhaps to those veterans. And we see on the right-hand side an African American. In the center, we see a European American. And on the left-hand side, we see Hispanic American. And what was interesting about this is, like, Maya Lin really hated it. And she said it can't go anywhere near the wall because it conflicted with the space that she wanted to engage people in, to participate. She wanted people to go up to the wall, to sit, to find a name, to perhaps touch a name, and then to take a rubbing from it on a piece of paper that they could take away with them. So it's like a souvenir. But interestingly, what the Three Soldiers does is, it was sited a bit further back in the end. And what the Three Soldiers does is they look at this, they witness these events, they witness this participation. And I think that's quite interesting because, you know, war is about conflict, and it gives a kind of humanity perhaps to what's going on at the wall. They're actually looking, they're looking at people, remembering them, in fact. And I think this sets up a really interesting dialogue, because it's important to perhaps remember that as an architecture student, Maya Lin would have been fully aware of modernism and minimalism, and in fact land art at the time. And, you know, somebody like me or somebody like us, you know, people like us, were removed from Vietnam. And perhaps the way that it's textual or an intellectual kind of memorial appeals to us. But I think with many of the people that were incredibly affected by Vietnam, they wanted something which represented them, I guess, and something which perhaps represented their emotional loss rather than an intellectual loss. So I think this point really, this piece really counterpoints to that memorial. And in fact, the memorial, though it was incredibly contentious at the time, is I think one of the top 10 sites that's visited in the USA. And in fact, one of the things that Frederick Hart did with, they sell lots of memorabilia from the Three Soldiers, and that goes towards a charity to provide people to make rubbings from the wall. So I'm just going to go a bit closer to home now. So in this memorial is called The Shoes, and is sited along the River Danube in Budapest, the Pest side of Budapest. And in fact, I was there a few years ago, and I was walking along the river and just saw all of these shoes. And they're like real shoes. There's women's shoes, men's shoes, children's shoes, and they're cast into bronze. But they're life size. They're not made bigger. And in the shoes things are often put in the shoes, like flowers, and there are candles lit all the way along. And this memorial is a monument to the Hungarian Jews that were lined up along the River Danube in 1944 and shot by the Arrow Cross Party. And literally they would fall into the river. And I found this incredibly moving, because you do literally stumble upon it. You are walking past, you don't see it from a distance. It doesn't rise out of the ground. And because of that humbleness of it, it's really affecting. And literally you could put yourself in those shoes, because we all relate to shoes, we all relate to clothing. And when there's an absence of the human in that clothing, it really brings it home to you that there is a loss there. And I think that people still put notes and light the candles for people perhaps that are close to them, as well as the people that were killed in 1944. I'm going to move even more closer to home now and look at some memorials that are cited in London. And this is the Fourth Plinth, which is in Trafalgar Square, amongst all the other war memorials that are there, including Nelson's Column. And I go to London quite a lot, and Trafalgar Square, or I did go to Trafalgar Square quite a lot. And in fact, whenever I visited Trafalgar Square, it was the Fourth Plinth that I always looked at, because I wanted to see what was going on there. And this has been, the Fourth Plinth project was set up in 1999 by the Royal Society of Arts. And what it is the empty plinth was meant to have an equestrian statue on it. There's another equestrian statue in Trafalgar Square, but it was they never raised enough money for it. So it's always been left empty since the 18th century. And so the RSA decided, well, we don't want to put a permanent piece of sculpture there. Let's try putting temporary works there. And that's really enlivened this space. So I wanted to look at two pieces on there. There's been many, and many of them have been really fascinating, but I wanted to look at this one in particular. This one is Alison Lapper Pregnant, and it's made by Mark Quinn. And Alison Lapper is another artist, but she was born without arms and shortened legs. And Mark Quinn wanted to commemorate her as a monument to the future. He wanted to celebrate somebody who has conquered their own circumstances rather than somebody who's conquered the outside world. But really importantly, he's used Carrara marble, which often celebrates beauty. And I think in doing so, he's making not only a comment on perfection, physical perfection, but he's also making a comment on her own unique beauty. And in fact, another version of this was commissioned for the Paralympics in London too. So I think this is really poignant and really beautiful. And another one that I think was an incredible experience was for 100 continuous days in the summer of 2009, Anthony Gormley created a project where he put ordinary people on the plinth for an hour at a time. I think it was 2,400 people actually managed to go onto the plinth, and they could do anything they wanted within reason. They became known as plinthers. And lots of people applied to do this, and 2,400 people were chosen. And here we see our friend and colleague Sue Griffiths, and she was chosen to give her lecture on art and cats. She was a great cat lover, and it was a fantastic event because this concept literally put British people centre stage for this time. And I really like what Frank Skinner said about this. He said, it says more about Britishness than George IV and his horse, and maybe even more than Nelson. The fact that a corner of one of our most famous landmarks has been given over to a group of ordinary citizens to do with it what they will is a fabulous symbol of freedom and free speech. And it was a real spectacle as well, because what would happen is if you were one of the plinthers, you would go into a porter cabin, and then you would get into a cherry picker and you'd literally be craned on and off the plinth. So it was a great spectacle, and thousands of people watched it. And of course, it had a great presence on social media too. One that I always find that chokes me up is this one. And on the 1st of July in 2016, it was a centenary of the Battle of the Somme from the First World War. And Turner-winning artist Jeremy Deller and the director of the National Theatre, Rufus Norris, decided to get 1,600 male volunteers to dress in World War I uniform and literally permeate lots of different public spaces across the UK. So they entered things like the tubes, they went to railway stations, shopping centres, and it was like a flash mob. And they didn't say anything, but if a member of public went up to them, they would simply give them a card. And on that card, it would each card would bear the name, the age, the regiment of the person that they represented. So it really brought that World War I day back to life for a day. It was very significant as well, because in the first day of the Battle of the Somme, I think there were more casualties than I think in the rest of that battle. So lots of young men lost their lives. And I think this really made that come to life and really put sort of humanity onto that loss. The other thing that they would do is occasionally they would break out into song. We're here because we're here, to the tune of Auld Lang Syne. So lots of people got to see this, and it went viral all around the world. So many people actually managed to see it on social media as well as on the news. I'm going to briefly look at a more traditional statue now. This is another Turner winner's sculpture. This is by Gillian Waring, and it's a statue of Millicent Fawcett, who was a suffragist. And this statue, I think was commissioned in 2018, is the only female statue that stands in Parliament Square. So she stands amongst Winston Churchill, Mahatma Gandhi, Nelson Mandela. And although it's an incredibly traditional format for the statue, she's chosen to portray her as a 60-year-old. She hasn't glamorized her. She's in her old cloth coat, and she simply looks out with the slogan, "Courage calls to courage everywhere," which is what she said after Emily Davidson, I think it was Davidson, was killed in the Derby, on the Derby racecourse. But what's really interesting about this is, although she's on a plinth, what Gillian Waring has done is, in the plinth, has put photographic representations of many of the other suffragettes and suffragists that actually fought for the vote for women. And so literally, Millicent Fawcett stands on the efforts of many people. So I thought that was really poignant too. And I'm going to kind of end really by going back to the idea of Germany, which is what James E. Young talks about. And he talks about a lot of the negative monuments that have been commissioned there in response to their terrible past. Some years ago, I went to Berlin, and I was really struck by the openness of the way that they deal with their past. In a way, the whole city is like a huge monument. There's incredible transparency there. I went to the Reichstag, the Bundestag, and the new bits of the Parliament building is all built from transparent materials, glass and reflective stainless steel, not traditional materials of stone. And there's lots of interpretation and text panels throughout the city so that you can learn about the past. Many memorials are set into the ground and you literally stumble upon them. And these ones are actually called stumbling blocks. And in cobblestones, there are brass plaques that tell you who lived in the houses in front of the pavement. And if you walk around the city, you'll probably end up in the Tiergarten, which is opposite the big Holocaust memorial. And this memorial is the is the memorial to the homosexuals that were persecuted under Nazism. And this was built in 2008 by Elmgreen and Dragset. And they wanted to create a monument that related to the Holocaust monument, which is opposite the park, which is comprised of many, many concrete blocks. But inserted into the monument is a film of two men kissing. And this film changes every 2 years. And they wanted to create a kind of a living monument, a living memorial that doesn't stay static. I think there is now going to be one of two women kissing as well. And then just on from this, there's a really beautiful monument that you enter. And this is the Roma and Sinti monument. And I'm just going to play a piece of music. I hope it's not too loud. And what happens? And there's a black reflecting pool. Enter this broken paving slab, got all the contemplation vibrant, and then you put yourself in the pool while it's incredibly emotional. And perhaps that was because you've got the music playing as well. And I'm going to end on perhaps something that we could consider for a memorial to COVID. This actually isn't a memorial. This is a line of trees that Joseph Beuys planted in, I think, 82 in the Documenta Arts exhibition in Kassel in Germany. And it was this project was called 7,000 Oaks. And it was really at the start of the beginnings of the Green Party in Germany, which he helped to found. And he decided that he wanted his theme that year to be city forestation instead of city administration. And many people were really against all these trees being planted in their city. They wanted car parks and buildings. But I think looking back on it, they're really pleased now that these trees have been planted. Next to every tree is a stone block, and they were planted at the same time. And what's happened is the stone blocks stay the same, but the trees obviously grow. So the oak tree for Boyce was a symbol of regeneration. And perhaps it is our time now to shift away from creating monuments that centre around people and work with the environment sustainably to create memories. And certainly some county councils, I think in Suffolk, have already announced plans for a Heolion Wood to honour those that have died from COVID and to give people access to a place for reflection. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Stop screen sharing.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. That was really fantastic. Wonderful. Yeah, just wonderful. I learnt so much. And I'm sure everybody else did as well. It felt like a really good grounding, really, in memorialisation and you know, at least some of its forms. Oriel Myrddin Gallery do actually have plans to plant oak trees. We have a project which we haven't publicised that widely because it's, you know, it's a long-term project, but we are hoping to find land in and around Carmarthen to plant oak trees to commemorate the victims of COVID-19. So that's yeah, lovely to see Joseph Boyce out there. So we are going to have a 10-minute break. So we will come back at 7:45 and hear from Angela Maddock. Okay, thank you and see you in 10 minutes. I hope that was a long enough break for you all to do what you might have needed to do. One thing, I'm not sure if I said this at the beginning, but as with our other talks that we've done as part of the project, there will be questions after both the speakers. So you can type your questions in the chat. You can type them in as we go along. I'll try and keep an eye on it and note them down. And then I will ask questions to Sarah and Angela at the end of Angela's talk. And then we will also have an opportunity to go into breakout rooms after questions, and you know, we can discuss anything, but something might come up in the questions that people want to explore further in the breakout room. So hopefully everyone's back, and it's my great pleasure to introduce Angela Maddock. Angela has a PhD in textiles from the Royal College of Art and is Senior Honorary Research Fellow with the Faculty of Arts and Humanities at King's College and Honorary Research Fellow at Swansea College of Art. She has a special interest in arts in health and works with healthcare students. Angela exhibited at Oriel Myrddin Gallery. Hopefully some of you will have seen that wonderful exhibition. Sometimes all you can do is walk. A visual documentation of her walk from Carmarthen to Middlesbrough in October 2018. Her current making project, In Kind, invites people to send fabric-based items in for repair in return for stories. So, as I said, it's my great pleasure and a deep honour to have Angela talk as part of this project. So over to you, Angela.
I shall first unmute myself, which is useful, and now I'm going to share my screen with everybody. So where are we? There we go. This is the bit that always makes me feel a little bit nervous. I'm hoping everyone can see me. I can't see anyone else, so I'm just going to assume we're okay. So the first thing I'd like to do is to thank Sarah, really, because for me it is so important to be able to have a dialogue with somebody like Sarah. We worked together for a long time, so and we're friends, so it's really a kind of interesting dialogue we've had around how to do this talk, really. And what I wanted to do was to start by saying that I really think that when I'm looking at the idea of working with nurses and with this idea of, I called this sitting with Mary Seacole. And so I wondered, and other monumental nurses, and I wondered what it means to sit with something. And I actually do mean sit. And I feel also it's important to consider what it means to sit with an idea. And I have been doing that a lot, really, in the process of working out how to do this and what I really think about monuments, because they are tricky things. And I remember very recently watching Fran Lebowitz talking with Toni Morrison about what art should be. And Toni Morrison held very clearly that art should be a mirror. It should have within it some reflection of yourself or a way to find yourself. Whereas Lebowitz talked much more about art being a doorway or an opening to a new world. So it wasn't about yourself, it was about expansion. And I'm trying to hold on to that in some of the consideration I've given to the topics here. I also feel very strongly, and I return to some of the things that Sarah said, and I will as I'm talking, that one of the things to remember about memorials is that they are tricky. And they always will be tricky. They are an editing of history. I try to use the word monumental as well. Monumental having a sense of permanence, but also about importance and value. Things being monumental for the individual as much as for a community. And I suppose one of the reasons I get quite nervous when I talk about things like this is that many times my response to a work of art, and whether that might be a painting or a drawing or a photograph or indeed a sculpture, is very personal. I feel that I might describe myself as being pricked in the sense that Roland Barthes talked about the idea of being pricked by a thing, something piercing your skin. So let's have a little look at my monumental nurses. And I want to take people really on a journey of thinking about what nursing means for me. And I should start by saying that I'm owning up to my investment in nursing. I'm not a nurse, but I've just come out of quite a long period, a sustained period of working with the Florence Nightingale Faculty of Nursing, Midwifery and Palliative Care at King's College in London, which, kind of informs my thinking a lot around what nursing might be. And this is the trinity of the nursing trinity, 3 sculptures at the Royal College of Nursing. So I was maker in residence with the faculty there at King's, trying to find parallels between my own practice as a textile maker and working with cloth and threads and nursing education. So we have 3 very significant nursing figures here. We have Edith Cavell on the left, Mary Seacole, Florence Nightingale. And actually what's really beautiful for me is that in the reflection here in the middle is my friend Sue. Sue Westwood was kind of my mentor when I was at King's College. So it's nice that Sue is reflected in my camera lens. And so that idea of sitting with again, and sitting with sometimes uncomfortable feelings about things from the past. And when I went to the Royal College of Nursing with Sue, we spent a lot of time looking at old uniforms, and they brought these uniforms out that belonged to nurses from, particularly on the one on the right-hand side here is actually a Princess Alexandra uniform from the First World War. And I actually became very emotional handling these uniforms. And again, it's that idea of being pricked. Sarah said she felt choked at some things. I think the connection between clothing and the body and the absent or lost body has always been significant in my work. So I recognise those as being important. I'm going to talk about Edith Cavell first, of all the nurses I've so far mentioned, because I think one of the things that feels very important to me is that nurses always had a value in my life that I felt I was unable to aspire to. And I don't know whether that feels the same way as everyone else, but Edith Cavell, for many reasons, encapsulates that. And I'll talk a little bit about Cavell here. Edith Cavell was a British nurse who worked during the First World War. She was nursing in Belgium. She was arrested by the Germans and accused of, well, she most definitely nursed soldiers from both sides of the war, and also helped them to escape. And she was accused of espionage by the Germans and was executed in Brussels. And so this is the first statue that really kind of embodies this idea of, nursing qualities for me. It's a Carrara marble statue to memorialise Cavell. And this is actually, it's a statue I often visit when I'm in London. Like, I have special places that I might go, and Edith's is one, because it's next door to the National Gallery and the National Portrait Gallery, and stands in this really cacophonous place, but it's this beautiful, calm Carrara marble on a granite pedestal, and very modernist in style. And I want to say something about the words that are on this statue to help illuminate some of my thinking about why I could never be a nurse. It's a statue that is 175 tons in weight, so it's quite a monument, and it has a Cornish granite pedestal. And on the pedestal beneath the statue is an inscription which reads, Edith Cavell, Brussels, dawn, October the 12th, 1915. Patriotism is not enough. I must have no bitterness or hatred for anyone. And those are the words that Edith Cavell spoke to the Reverend Sterling Gahan, the Anglican priest who sat with her just before she was executed. As well as those words, also on the statue, on the face of the granite block behind the actual statue itself, there are words, and actually you can see the one at the top, humanity, and then on each side, for king and country, devotion, fortitude, and sacrifice. So in many ways, Cavell has been described as the nurse who most accurately describes the idea of the British stiff upper lip, and embodies that for me. I'm going to move on to a very personal connection with another nurse now. And this is what I describe Dora as, my childhood nurse. This is Sister Dora. I grew up in the Black Country in the West Midlands in a town called Wednesbury, and Walsall is right next door to Wednesbury and was the family hospital. My strong memory as a child was of going to my nan's physiotherapy sessions. So I am getting quite personal in my storytelling. I like stories. And I only knew her as Sister Dora. In fact, I knew the hospital as Sister Dora's Hospital. I want to say a little bit more about Sister Dora too. I never actually knew her stories as a child, but I knew that everybody said Sister Dora's Hospital. And I come back to that in a moment. Let me tell you a little bit more about Dora. She was one of 11 children with a dominant father. She was left £90 by her mother on her death and joined the Good Samaritans, a kind of a Christchurch sisterhood in Middlesbrough. I'm afraid I keep finding these moments of serendipity. I thought, crikey, she was also from Middlesbrough and I walked there. Anyway, she was sent as a novice nun. She left home probably only when she was about 30, but she was sent as a novice nun to be the relief nurse at Walsall Cottage Hospital in 1866. She oversaw the redevelopment of the whole hospital and stayed there until her death. She died in a house on Wednesbury Road of breast cancer that she decided herself would not be treated at the age of 49. She was the sister in charge at Walsall for 14 years. So let's tell you a little bit more about Sister Dora. Sister Dora did not go to Crimea, so although she was very much aware of the Crimea nursing and wanted to be part of it, she wasn't involved. Instead, she took on a lot of Nightingale's ideas, and a lot of the work that she did do once she got to Walsall. I mean, she wasn't trained as a nurse. She kind of trained as she started the work, really, but she made massive strides. She arrived at in a very industrialized Black country town with lots of very serious industrial injuries, lots of illness, and it was actually ridden with smallpox at the time. So she did so much work to clean the place up in the sense that she became obsessed with cleanliness. And I'll fill in a little bit more about the other things about Sister Dora, but what I want to talk about particularly is the strength of community in the bonds that have built up locally with the Sister Dora statues. There were actually 2 iterations of the Sister Dora statue. The first thing to tell you about Sister Dora was that on her death, when she was 49, her coffin was carried by railway workers. They were so devastated by the loss of this woman who had in many ways turned around the health and well-being of their community. They wanted to bear her body to the graveside. There were also stories that Dora's funeral would be very private and would not include people like the local factory workers, and there were stories that they broke down the gates to the cemetery so that they could be involved. This is the first Sister Dora statue on the left-hand side. Well, all 3 are different iterations of the first statue, which was made with Carrara marble. And actually the money for this was raised by the idea really of leaving boxes in workplaces so people would put pennies in, and it was really raised from local subscriptions. So we have this statue, which, and another personal story, was actually unveiled by a chap called Mr. Beebe, and I grew up in Beebe Road, so I do apologise, but I'm starting to see all sorts of things going on here. And I must tell you that the last card, this is actually a postcard. I love the idea that you might go on a day trip to Walsall, which was a very straight, a very very polluted, very noisy at the time, but also quite significant industrial market town, that you might send a postcard of Sister Dora somewhere. But this postcard now belongs to me because I chased it down. This statue of Sister Dora is the world's first statue of a nurse. Beyond that, it is the first statue of a woman in the United Kingdom that is not a member of the royal family, and also a woman who has her clothes on, and I think that's really significant. Unfortunately, it did not survive because of the quite polluted airs. What happened was that the statue started to disintegrate and was replaced. And again, the original statue was replaced with a cast in bronze. Now, there was a really interesting conversation with my mum this morning that involved lots of backs and forwards, because there was a real sense of what happened to Sister Dora's statue. Where is it? My mum and I were discussing where she might be, and I think I'll explain some more of that story in a moment. But what we see here is this very formidable Sister Dora atop another plinth, unfolding a bandage. And it's very iconic. And I can remember going to these sessions with my nan and going to Sister Dora's hospital and sitting and waiting. And again, we have this notion of sitting and waiting. So there we go with that one. So the actual statue has 4 panels. And I'll just very quickly highlight the 4 panels. So we see Sister Dora sitting, or Sister Dora sitting with a baby, talking behind her to one of the doctors at the hospital, nursing patients. She was very well regarded. There were two particular events that are depicted in these panels. Three, actually. This is the smallpox epidemic that she turned around by really including a lot of the discoveries that were made during the Crimea period around cleanliness, washing, burning bed linen that was perished. But we also have two big events here. The first one here, you can see this is Pelsall Colliery. This is a huge mining disaster, and Dora is pictured here supporting families. And the second one, or the one slightly in from it, is actually the Birch Hills Ironworks furnace blast explosion. And this was a time when treating burns was almost impossible, and Dora actually moved into the hospital to care for these patients. Only 2 of the 10 who survived the immediate blast actually survived. So what we have building in my mind's eye is this idea of nurses as being these kind of almost like, well, they're selfless. This is the thing I alluded to earlier, this discussion about where is Sister Dora. And we can see that the Sister Dora statue is right in the middle of Walsall. And actually, I hope you can find my arrow. But if we go down here, this is Wednesbury Road. And this is where the original hospital site that Sister Dora worked at, or basically established, was built. And then up here we have Bridgeman Street. And Bridgeman Street, at the time, the hospital had to be closed for a time, and it was being redeveloped. And during this time, she moved the whole hospital into a residential house on Bridgeman Street, which again became infected with typhoid and had to be closed. But during that time, she would be carrying patients up and down the stairs herself. And mostly her patients were kind of big men, you know, so she was quite hands-on in her nursing. And then here is the Sister Dora statue at the centre of town. That's just to show you that she is there, really. But one of the problems with thinking about statues, especially someone like Sister Dora, is that you get lots of iterations. So Sister Dora has a legacy too, and that legacy is that there's a celebration every year around the site of her statue, but also lots of hospital wards named after Sister Dora. And as I said, she's the first statue of a woman, not a member of the royal family. We also have too this idea, a memory that something that I should say is that during her decline, her own illness, she went to work with Joseph Lister and took on board lots of his ideas about aseptic treatment of wounds. And actually the death rate for industrial accidents at the time of Dora's work in Walsall was lower than it was in teaching hospitals in London. She also has a tram named after her. So the next time I'm home in the Midlands, I'm going to go and try that tram. This brings me then to the monument that Emily asked me if I would talk about. And as Emily said, the Crimea is much more associated with nursing perhaps than with fighting. And I think this is quite crucial. And I first came across this memorial when I was actually on a trip I was on a walking trip with the Gay Outdoor Club, which was part of my engagement series of workshops that ran around my exhibition. And I really didn't know this statue, and it struck me as being very unusual for lots of reasons, not least because of these the crossed muskets alongside the statue, and the very unusual cast iron railings. What's really interesting for me too is that this again was paid for by a colonel himself who gave the funds for the statue to be built. It originally had a Russian gun from the war placed in front of the monument in 1859, but this was later removed. And I think if you know Carmarthen very well, and I hope some of you do, then it's actually on Lammer Street, and it's on a sort of middle island on its own. But what it brings me to think about is what is not there, and what is absent, and that is what we were talking about earlier in this sense of what monuments do show and what they often leave out. They are responsible for editing history too. What happens for me when I look at this is the knowledge that we are dealing with in war terms, specifically with the Crimean, is understanding the role of nursing and how much nursing improved well-being and outcomes for soldiers. The fact is that in the Crimean War, disease killed 4 times as many soldiers as battle wounds, resulting in the deaths of 25,000 British, 100,000 French, and up to 1 million Russians. And that's why I pop back to Florence Nightingale. I am not going to talk very much about Florence Nightingale because she is well known to all of us. She has a huge legacy. But I am going to really say, kind of promote Florence Nightingale as really an instrument in healthcare policy. She was incredibly important in getting us to understand the importance of the aseptic technique and clean hands, but she was always also a really good statistician. And this is a very famous, and you'll have to go and look at this yourselves because you'll run out of time otherwise, but this is a very beautifully described rose diagram. And just to explain what these areas mean, what Nightingale found was that one of the ways to actually describe what was happening to us visually, and her way of promoting changes really was to work with showing statistics in a kind of visual way. And this very beautiful one, if we read here, these blue wedges actually describe the number of deaths that occurred across all fronts during the period of the Crimean from illness, from disease. The deaths that are described as being from actual other, well, I think it's the red areas are the ones that actually relate to lost in battle or lost from wounds. So we can see that more soldiers perished right through until we get towards the end and we start to see her impact, and very few soldiers dying from actual dysentery, typhoid, cholera. So she's really a social and healthcare reformer. We see her legacy everywhere, not least that I worked at the Florence Nightingale Faculty of Nursing and Midwifery, that she established nursing schools, but we also see her legacy in the continuing idea of how a ward might look. This is the sort of set out of a Florence Nightingale ward even. And this you can actually see at the National Museum of Wales. So here we have Florence Nightingale, and she is on her granite pedestal. This is one of many statues of Florence Nightingale, and it's classically one of those statues that we look up at and that we find ourselves having to raise our eyes to see. But I'm going to talk a little bit more about Mary Seacole, and I'm going to try and go a little bit off piste with hopefully reading my notes too much. Mary Seacole, 1805 to 1881, is often not understood to be, she's quite absent from histories of nursing until more recently. Seacole was Creole. She was a mixed race, Scots, Jamaican, and she described herself as a Creole woman. She lived in Jamaica, grew up in Jamaica alongside her mum, who was a hotelier, but was also a healer. So she learned from her mum. She travelled a lot. She saw other she treated people. She came to live in Britain. She wanted to go to work in the Crimean alongside Nightingale, but was refused. Nightingale said, "I'm not having you." In fact, I think if I find my notes that she said, she arrived waiting for her interview, and it wasn't Nightingale that she met with. It was I can't find her name now, but what's really interesting is that she was told we don't need any more nurses, and she was actually sitting outside with other nurses waiting to be interviewed. She's described somewhat disparagingly sometimes as a sutler. Now, sutlers were people who basically worked in a kind of early iteration of what the naffy is, and went out to war and took things that soldiers might need, which might include down bandages, but also would include magazines and food and so on. So what Seacole did was actually fund her own journey. See, she paid for herself to go out there. So we have Seacole here depicted by Punch magazine, holding aloft, selling one of their Punch magazines to one of the soldiers. She was often disparaged, although, and she didn't work with, she set up a hotel. So the hotel she set up was known as the British Hotel. And so we see this is actually inside the British Hotel. And she's disparaged as being only caring for the actual officers. This isn't true, and there are lots of things to say about Mary that take us beyond that idea. She followed alongside lots of Nightingale's work as well. So she used a lot of Nightingale's ideas, but she was actually a much more hands-on nurse. So we have lots of descriptions of her being, let me find this quote, lovely quotes around her being the daughter of the regiment, or known as Mother Seacole, and very much in there chatting, comforting, whereas Nightingale's less described as being a nurse of old-fashioned nursing skills, I suppose. She was very much more hands-off. It's argued that Seacole actually learned most of these attributes came from her working alongside her mother too. So she was a compassionate nurse. She became known across the world. There are descriptions of people writing about Seacole, articles appearing in newspapers about Seacole, as far away as New Zealand, in all across Europe, in Australia as well. Her biography was translated into German, so that it was well reviewed in Switzerland. So we have all these beautiful things that become kind of legacies of Seacole, and her determination to pay for her own passage to go and nurse out in Crimea. And I'm going to show you, moving now to the actual statue of Mary Seacole, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about the background behind this statue. I'm very aware of time racing, so I won't go into as much detail as I'd like to. What I want to tell you to start with is that it's a huge modernist statue, and when I look at this, I think very clearly, when I came across it for my first experience, was that I was working with staff at Guy's and St Thomas's. So this statue is on the bank of the River Thames in front of St Thomas's Hospital, and Mary is in the pose as if walking to the river. And it's huge. But the very important thing for me to say straight away is that when Sarah talked about looking up, one thing I wrote down very quickly in my notes is that I'm not looking up at Mary, I'm standing with her, I'm standing alongside her. And this was something I was very aware of when I first came across her when I was working at St Thomas's, that you are part of what's, you can walk up to her and you can stand alongside her. Both the figure and the disc behind are cast in bronze, and the bronze disc at the back is actually made from a cast of the Sebastopol soil, where she set up the British Hotel. In front is a text carved in, and it says, "I trust that," and this is written, these are the words of Sir William Howard Russell, who was the Times Crimean War correspondent, and he wrote, "I trust that England will not forget one who nursed her sick, who sought out her wounded to aid and succour them, and who performed the last offices of some of her illustrious dead." I can tell you that this statue caused such a huge controversy around being built, not least from the opposition from the Florence Nightingale Society. It took 12 years to raise the funds for the statue. She is not, as I would argue, a Victorian ideal of a nurse. She's described as being quite a wild creature herself. And I'll read you some of the testimony. And actually, this is taken directly from the records of the Florence Nightingale Society. You can see these online. They're not very edifying, but they started a campaign of writing to many people that were connected with raising the profile for the need for the statue and also in raising the funds. And this is written this one is addressed to Sir Simon Stevens, who is the current leader of the NHS in England. Work is going ahead at St Thomas's Hospital on the site for the proposed statue to be labelled Pioneer Nurse, on which we have raised vigorous objections, brackets, not to a statue anywhere, but not on Nightingale's hospital, and not labelling a restaurant or a bar owner as a pioneer nurse. We expect that, should the installation go ahead, the site will become a monument to political correctness. Will it even become a place where vandals might gather? Now, one of the really tricky moments was this kind of description of her being really quite not ladylike in her own behaviour. And they talk about the broken bottles that were sometimes found around the British Hotel. And the Nightingale letter describes them. What happens then if the statue itself becomes a site for drinking and drunkenness? Well, my experience of the statue is anything but. And you can see here that if we talk about connection between statues and what they might mean for us, what is really clear to me is how we open doorways for people to see new opportunities and how we engage differently across communities with different statues. This is every year around the annual, she was actually unveiled by Fluella Benjamin from TV fame, for those of us old enough to remember Fluella Benjamin's work. But particularly here, there's this lovely joyfulness that describes to me not this sense of gloom and doom and possibility that she might become a site of vagrants. And I'm going to finish a little bit now with, I'm going to say not very much more about her, because this particularly is one of the things that struck me very much, and this is very personal again, was the idea that when I went to see this statue and I sat with Mary Seacole, I realised that sitting with her, her foot is quite polished. And I mentioned this in an Instagram post, and my friend Liz said there's something about the how touching it is that people want to be in contact with the goodness of nursing. And also I think that she becomes a talisman for people that visit the hospital. So touching a statue is really quite something, you know, that it's not discouraged, she's on our level. And I witnessed this too in the Winston Churchill monument in the Houses of Parliament, in the Speaker's lobby, members' lobby rather. And actually, if you look here, his foot is so worn, now discouraged from touching it. What then happens when we don't memorialise nurses, when they don't have monuments made for them or after them, when they're not figured in bronze? This is Betsy Cadwallader, the Crimean War nurse Elizabeth Davis, who is Welsh. And she said of Nightingale herself, "I did not like the name of Nightingale. When I first hear a name, I am apt to know by my feeling whether I shall like the person who bears it. And it would seem that actually Nightingale didn't have great fondness for her. She described Elizabeth or Betsy as an active, respectable, hard-working, kind-hearted old woman with a foul tongue and a cross temper. The very important thing about Betsy is, again, we find this sense of a woman who isn't kind of embodying what might have been described as the Victorian ideals of a nurse, who runs away from home as a young woman, who travels the world, who has multiple love affairs, who learns her nursing on board ships, who learns to deliver babies on board ships, that she becomes, in many ways, she has this stubborn character. You know, she went to see the aftermath of the Battle of Waterloo, and when, after seeing that, said she wanted to nurse. She came back and did nursing. She trained as a nurse at Guy's Hospital and decided to go over to the Crimea at the age of 65. Now, Nightingale actually said, almost to the words, you know, over my dead body, I don't want Betsy to go, it's not right. And she did go, and they did nurse together. But actually, they fell out so many times that Betsy Cadwallader had to go nurse somewhere else. So also there's a lot of discussion about, you know, that she was working class, that they were polar opposites in lots of ways. And she was often told by Nightingale that she had to behave in a certain way. It's also understood that Florence Nightingale had a very low opinion of the Welsh at the time. So that's quite interesting. So it struck me that when I tried to find a monument to Betsy, the only thing is really a headstone in Abney Park Cemetery in London. Betsy, I should also add, did just as well as Florence in when she moved hospitals. She went much closer to the front than Florence Nightingale ever did, and actually had made massive contributions in terms of well-being and health of soldiers, both wounded and dying as well. So her legacy is really strong. And I thought the only thing she has, the material thing, is a headstone. She was buried in a pauper's grave, and this is her headstone, paid for by nurses from Betsy Cadwallader NHS Trust. And actually that's where I want to finish with her, is this idea that she has no stone, but what bigger legacy might one have than to find a whole health board honouring her in their naming. I'm going to come right up to the present now, and I know I've run a little bit over, and I hope you give me just a couple of minutes to add a couple of things about the current situation. We are living through, hopefully coming towards the end of a very long period that has put all of us, particularly healthcare workers of all types, under great strain. And I want to think about how we memorialise nurses now. The Royal College of Nursing has its own online book of remembrance, and I will leave that for you to look for yourselves. I think it's fair to say that it's very, very touching in terms of the idea of being pricked or being choked. You will have both. I think one of the public imagination was very much captured by the clap for carers. And now we see this second iteration that took off really over Christmas and the New Year. We see a movement towards understanding that it's not just nurses who are involved in care, but also talking about clap for heroes. I think there's a real problem with naming healthcare workers and care workers heroes. It follows on from the ideology of talking about nurses as being, in the words that described Edith Cavell, as being devoted, like sacrificial lambs, like so selfless. St. Paul's Church, St. Paul's Cathedral rather, has the most beautiful book called Remember Me, and it's all online. And again, I would encourage you to look at that. I've been thinking a lot too about going back to Mary Seacole, and the Office for National Statistics has said that Black, Asian, minority and ethnic nurses are more likely to die and get COVID than any other nurses. In fact, their very own statistics remind us, and again, I would say that they remind us in a somewhat sobering way, that 94% of doctors who have died are from BAME backgrounds, 71% of nurses, so 71% of nurses as well, from BAME backgrounds have died. The total nursing workforce, BAME nurses make up only 20% of the total nursing workforce, and yet 71% of the deaths. as many nurses have now died from coronavirus than were killed during the entirety of the First World War. And those are statistics quoted by the International Council of Nurses. The latest figures collated by the Federation show that 1,500 nurses have lost their lives since the pandemic began. The Royal College of Nursing has created its own memorial as well, and again it's an online one, and I would ask you to look at it yourself. I think it's quite mawkish to be sharing things like that in this sort of environment. The BMJ has their own online memorial too, and again that's incredibly sobering. What I'd like to suggest is that the clap for caring, and I'm going to be very political here, diverts our attention away from the true problems of this situation, the lived experience of nursing and caring and being a doctor, a midwife, of being a cleaner, of being a porter in these situations. When I remember at the very beginning, friends talking to me about wearing swimming goggles as PPE, I feel the whole clap for carers was very problematic and kind of became this way of talking about selflessness again. We're talking about bus drivers too losing their lives. So I bring you very finally to the one thing that I'm working on at the moment, and I'm trying really hard I'm working with Swansea Bay University Health Board on a project with the staff across the whole health board about how we might commemorate. And I think what we're trying to do is come away from the word memorial to look at ways of finding how to recognise what has actually been a really hard and painful time and still continues to be so. And I established a project called Finding Words. And Finding Words is a postal art project which invites staff from across the whole trust, regardless of what their job role is or whether they were on the front line, to respond to a project that I've created that has 4 questions in it that are reflective, that ask, what might you hold on to? What would you want to leave behind? What kept you going? And what might you want to happen? How might we celebrate, or rather commemorate, hold on to, take special time out? So what I think I'm trying to do is to work with the staff really to share responsibility. I think one thing that I feel is quite important in terms of commemoration is that the ideas for commemoration come from the people who've been involved in the actual work. It has been and will continue to be a really moving project for me, and I think that's really important to actually say, because as I've said, I've been involved in nursing care, or not nursing care, working with nursing teachers or educators for a while. And I'm a witness. I like listening to stories. So for a lot of me, I'm thinking about this as being an exercise in witnessing, in gathering stories. And it's been incredibly touching to talk to some of the people who are taking part. For example, the mortuary team at Morriston Hospital working on this project as a group, the physiotherapists doing the same. And for me to be recognising also, and for all of us to recognise the depth and reach of the people who are involved in hospitals and out in the community as well. So the porters, the domestics, administrative staff, all taking part. And I'm really looking forward to how that develops. As a project in itself, it will then go on to, in many ways, inform what happens next. So it's a kind of, it's a fact-seeking mission. And I'm hoping, and I reach back to Sarah now and the lovely words she said about, how do we celebrate? Do we have to have these monuments? Because one thing is really clear to me is monuments need looking after themselves. And it's clear from the Carmarthen monuments that we're living in straitened times, that they're not great things. It's just more stuff to care for. And actually, perhaps what we need to be doing more is caring for ourselves. I like to finish by dedicating my talks to somebody, to somebody, and actually that somebody for me is going to be my son, and I hope he's not given up on me, and I'd like to say thank him for his work as a nurse. And I also want to leave him there as kind of the knowledge that nurses don't have to be women anymore. And this is also something we need to be addressing in how our sense of building, rebuilding cultures. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Angela.
And
That's really fantastic.
I talked for too long.
No, it's great. I could listen to you all night, and I see there's a little message in the chat there from David.
He said, "Oh my God, mother."
No, he said thank you very much. He's a well brought up young man. So yeah, that was really fantastic. Thank you so much. So much in there. Very, very rich. And thank you for bringing these discussions so up to date. And yeah, it throws up a lot of stuff about, you know, who we memorialize, if we do that, and how we do it, and also that sort of like, how long do you wait? It's interesting to me that there are already so many conversations about how to remember the victims of COVID when we are still in a full lockdown in Wales. You know, this is by no means over. Yes, it feels like the end might be in sight, but it's interesting that those conversations, there's a real hunger to memorialize an event that's still happening. It's strange and interesting. We will have I think maybe just one question, because otherwise we won't have much time in our breakout rooms. But there is a very good question here somewhere. Let me find it. I'm sorry, bear with me. Here we go. It's from Rhys Kaminsky-Jones, who is an academic. And it says, a lot has been talked about since the Colston statue was toppled about the possibility of artistically recontextualizing problematic statues. Do you know of any good examples of this? Have you got any favourites? I mean, this is, yeah, it's an interesting, it's a very specific question. Some of Sarah's examples, e.g. the fourth plinth, seemed close to this perhaps, although that was a plinth with an absence of a statue. I know that there is stuff in Eastern Europe that's happened with things like Lenin statues in the Eastern Bloc, but do either of you have any examples or thoughts about that, about recontextualizing a problematic statue?
Well, I think especially with the Colston statue, there were petitions to have the plaque changed many years ago, but it just kept, I think the Bristol City Council kept putting it off and not allowing that to happen. So as far as I know, there probably are some, but I don't know of any that actually have been reinterpreted or told other stories as yet, unless they've been doing that online or something like that. I mean, the closest really that comes to it, I guess, is, and Angela, you probably know more about this than me, but in Berlin, when you see fragments of the wall and places where people actually tried to escape from East Germany, and you'd see a white cross there and sometimes some text there. But actually, as far as the way in the UK, the way that we've done that, I don't think we've actually been really good enough at updating and recontextualizing and making these monuments relevant. I think in her talk a couple of weeks ago said, you know, they don't speak to me. And I think that's so true for many people. And I think that's what if we are going to keep these monuments in places, we've got to set up a dialogue so that it does pique people's interest and people can debate issues or retell what's happened. I don't know what you think, Angela, but
I can't really respond very much to the individual question about thinking about recontextualizing, but one of my particular interests has been watching, and I talked with Sarah about it earlier in the week, about how different cultures work with their own histories, really, and really problematic histories of violence. And I think the way the Germans had this sort of like Freudian response about, you must talk about it, we've got to get it out there because the unconscious will only come back again. And I do wonder if we need something like that to happen here as well. You know, really need to start talking about it. I think actually the Seacole statue has kind of come into its own time as well. There's something really beautiful and dynamic and powerful. I mean, Martin Jennings, who's the sculptor, describes the disc, the solid wall behind her, that she's walking towards Parliament, that she's kind of striding. And the disc is actually a representation, not just of the soil and the land of where of Sebastopol, but it's actually a representation of her being stonewalled as a black woman. You know, you cannot go. You're a badly behaved black woman. You have to stay. You're not going. And she goes anyway. And he talks about, and her statue went up the week after Brexit happened, or the vote happened. And he talks about that statue as being there for black women, you know, young black women, because it says, do it, just do it anyway. And I think that's a really powerful statue. And actually, it's kind of, there was so much trouble about it being in Florence Nightingale's patch on her ground, because it's at St. Thomas's, which is where her nursing school was founded. And I think that statues like that will enable some revisiting but we still have got all these, you know, they're not going to go away. History doesn't, we are revisiting history all the time, aren't we?
Yeah. Great, thank you.